Hey everybody, welcome to Reading Crossbow. My name is Lana, and this is my buddy Rob. That's my buddy Rob. Yeah, thanks for being my co-host on this podcast journey, Rob.
Yeah, no, I'm excited to see to discuss this book you had us read.
Yeah, for those of you new here, quick thing, we are just two nerds who love very different types of books. I usually love your romantic fantasy. Rob usually loves your grimdark fantasy. And we read 2 books a month. We make it very easy for all adults to get back into reading. And this month, first book is Face the Night by Lani Forbes. And I had a fun time with this one and very interesting. It was not romantic fantasy and it was not grimdark. It was... drumroll, a Western.
A Western fantasy romance.
A Western fantasy romance. I've never heard of that.
I don't think it's a thing.
Yeah, I should just pick books randomly way more often because we would have never read this. I didn't even really take a look at it at all before I was like, that one. So, yeah.
Yeah, right. No, it is a very interesting read. It's unlike, I think, anything else I've read in a long time.
Ever. A quick overview of the book to talk about nothing we've ever read in a long time because it's so true. So basically this story follows a female protagonist. We can't seem to get away from our female protagonist yet, named Catriona McGregor, who is an outlaw, but didn't used to be an outlaw. She was once a baroness. She's about to inherit, or she would have inherited, this amazing ranch. So in this book, instead of kingdoms like we've had in past books, we have ranches, which is amazing. So fun. So horrible thing happens in the beginning of the book. She loses her parents to some horrible evil plot. A neighboring baron wants her land, her parents' land. So kind of awful. She ends up losing them. She runs away because, she thinks it's her fault. She blames it on herself. Kind of a core story point in this book. Runs away and is adopted by a band of outlaws. So these outlaws raise her and she eventually becomes Black Cat Whitfield because her adopted father figure is Amos Whitfield, the Wolf of the West. And basically she runs around with them. She gets really well known as a sharpshooter, aided by this sort of magic. We'll get into that more. It's a blessing, not so much magic. And that leads her to this plan to eventually save her land. So that's a very quick overview of it. I should say she has to save her land from another new evil plot happening where the original baron who killed her parents is trying to get that land back.
And for actually the majority of this story, Black Cat Kate is actually going undercover as a governess for the younger daughter of her parents' killer in order to uncover what his sinister plot is and, bring it to light.
And what's even more amazing about that, in plot thickens moments, the Baron's son was her best friend growing up. And they had this really amazing tight bond. And, oh, surprise! When she shows up all these years later, he's now hot and attractive.
Well, and I guess he is too.
Yeah, he is. And his name's Adrian, so Sex in the City. I don't know, Rob, did you never watch Sex in the City?
Sure.
No, that's a no. That's code Rob for no, he did not. So, I kind of wanted to talk about the beginning of this story just to, kind of lure our readers into the Western a bit, because I know a lot of you are thinking, Western? No, I'm not so sure. Well, we find our protagonist, Kat, locked behind a jail cell, and this is where we sort of get an introduction into her magical powers because she could see something that's about to happen, which leads us into talking a little bit about the saints in this book and how things sort of work. Since it's a Western, it's important to bring up that there's a little bit of religion. I think about Catholicism somewhat with the saints, and these saints bless their the people that they choose to give their gift to. Not everybody has magic. Not everybody is one of the blessed. I said blessed. when I was reading this in my mind, even though I don't say blessed out loud.
Yeah, no, and for the genre, blessed seems like the right word choice for what it is. And within the setting, these blessed, these people with these powers given to them by these saints are actually exceedingly rare. So it seems like a very low magic setting. But the each saint seems to give people different powers. Like one gives a power of healing, another has a power of almost like paralyze people. But that's like briefly, and that's used to basically gently take someone into custody. For example, you could just basically say, nope, you don't get to move anymore. And although within the setting of this book, there's really only one blessed that we get to see, which is the main character.
And what's interesting is, I have to give you guys a spoiler alert, there's going to be no rate the map in this episode because there is no map, but there is a glossary that I paid a lot of attention to when I was reading this book, and it does list the saints and it does list the powers that they give, and yeah, really only a couple of them are ever really referred to, but that was very helpful.
Yeah, and it does give a little bit of world building where it shows like, here's the other kind of stuff that would be out there if this was able to be expanded upon into a bigger series in the future.
So now that we've done the basic overview of the story, our heroine, this tale with the governor, getting her land back, finding a former friend who becomes in love, that kind of leads us into talking a little bit more about the magic system and how it works in Face the Night. And Robert, you're great with magic systems. How about you tell our listeners about the magic system?
So the magic system in this book, essentially what it's, for the majority of people who become one of these blessed, it's actually during their baptism. They're taken to a church and as a baby and they get baptized. And for a very small number of people, and basically as they get baptized, there'll be almost a glowing aura amongst them and on one of the statues of one of the saints, identifying which saint this person has been blessed by. And these blessed each gain a special power related to the saint that has blessed them. So in the case of the main character, she has been blessed with a power of foresight, where she can basically see a few seconds into the future. She, when there's danger. So if someone is pointing a gun at her, she will basically see that they're about to shoot, and so she can actually dodge bullets. Not perfectly, she still has to move, but it does give her a little bit of warning when danger is afoot.
Yes, and with all magic systems, there has to be some sort of balance of power with the magic. And it does almost feel weird to call this magic, because it doesn't feel very magic-like it does in other books, but the balance of this power is aurium, which is this metal, or this ore, if you will, in the earth. And when used, this metal will counteract certain powers, or it gives the wielder or the person using the metal an opportunity to have some form of power itself, but it doesn't last long. So the metal can be cursed. It doesn't really say how in this book, but the metal can be cursed, and then when the metal's cursed, and if it's touching somebody, then whatever power whatever saint it's been cursed with, the metal will have that power for a certain amount of time. So if it's a small amount of metal, it won't last very long. If it's a lot, it'll last longer. And then it talks about a powdered version later in the book, and if it's powdered, then you would need a whole lot of it for the magical effect to work. An example of this is in the very beginning of the story, when Kat is being held by handcuffs, and it kind of temporarily sort of snuffs out her power.
Yeah, or they had a person with a bullet, and the bullet basically, as soon as you were shot by it, the bullet, since it has this magical element in it, it basically paralyzes you. In a way, this kind of commodifies magical powers, because normal people can get this aurium. However, the church has deemed this to be cursed or evil, and therefore it's kind of illegal or forbidden to use this Orium, because it is a corrupted version of these saints' abilities.
And interesting here is, I think what I find unique about this book is because the magic system comes from saints, right? Saints were once human in the book. So they're humans who became saints through whatever way their religion or the law of the land chooses to make them saints, or whatever divine right occurs. The Orium was made by a fallen saint, which is very interesting. And so that's a huge part of the book too, is like the bad stuff, the bad magic came from the saint that's fallen. It doesn't really talk about why the saint had fallen, at least when they're talking about the saint in the early parts of the book.
So when a person gets blessed by one of these saints, it's essentially because the saint has a purpose for them. There's a mission, a divinely inspired mission for them. They don't personally know what the mission is, but the saint does, and that's why they've gifted them this ability, so that they will have the means to accomplish the saint's goals in the future. Whereas the fallen saint, he's putting out this corrupted version of this power that anyone can use without any purpose, or for any nefarious means. He's putting it out there for people to just use for themselves. So it's a very interesting sort of dichotomy between the saints and then the fallen saint. There is a supreme being, but it's not directly worshipped necessarily.
Yeah. They never talk about like God. It's not a religious book. I don't want to put anybody off that might put them off for it, but it does fit into this Western theme though. This makes sense to me that this is how magic would be wielded in like this kind of Western themed book. It makes sense that they're saints. And I actually kind of love that for the book. And I do like that the counteracting magic, the magic found in this Orium by the fallen saint, has like a timer on it, right? Like you only get power for a brief amount of time. It's not like power everlasting, and it's not mission based, like you said. So the blessed have a divine mission they have to fulfill, and then anyone who obtains this power to sort of counteract them, it doesn't last long. And it does say that anytime somebody's using Orium, it's always bad. It's never good. It's always cursed.
At least certainly from the church's point of view.
Yeah, well, from what I read, anyhow.
Because normal people would avoid it because they think it would be sinful. So only people who don't care about the sin are the ones really using it. So yeah, they're probably using it for bad reasons. And
it's also rare, too. It's really found only by the wealthy. Like this book, another predominant part of the book is the vast difference between the wealthy and the not wealthy. And there's a couple moments in this book that really make it feel like what I called a Western Robin Hood. And really, Catriona's adoptive father, Amos Whitfield, he is a real life like Robin Hood bandit. He is literally stealing from the rich, so in this case ranch owners, and giving to actually the missions, the churches. And that was a very interesting part of the book. So we have this like Robin Hood sort of theme, and it also happens with the governor's son, the baron who I had talked about had killed her parents in the beginning. He also has this test in the beginning of the book, so this is not a spoiler. It's just a test of his character, where the father wants to see if he has it in him to do what needs done, and aid his land and build their fortune. And basically it's stealing from the poor in that situation, or not taking the right amount of money from them for what they're worth, right? Not valuing their work. So yeah, very much Western fantasy Robin Hood.
Yeah. And a lot of the things in this book do help lean into that kind of a Western feel. This Orium, it's found, people are digging it up kind of like during the gold rush era of the Old West. Other elements that kind of give you an Old West type feel is like there is the law are these kind of faceless soldiers, not necessarily police. A lot of them are actually just soldiers of the far off empire, that are stationed here. Like the kind of lead soldier is called Captain Freeman, and he's the representative of the empire, but it kind of gives a feel almost like a cavalry captain in the Old West.
All right, so let's talk about the prose of the book, like we've done before. So, what were your favorite parts of this book?
For the most part, my favorite parts really was the just general Western kind of tropes. You have an outlaw hero. There's like a train hijacking of sorts. There's like a jailbreak scene. Gun shootouts between the outlaws and the corrupt lawmen. There's like this corrupt politician that's out to basically seize all the money and exploit, for his own purposes. There's a drunken alcoholic priest that is just out there to do the right thing, but he also wants to make a little wine on the side.
Exactly. I mean, how we both wrote down, when we were preparing for this episode, our favorite parts. We both wrote down that we just love the Western. We've said it several times already. I love the Western aspect of this, and I think I loved it because I didn't know it was coming. Even when I read the jacket of the book, I don't necessarily think I picked up on it as much as it was going to be. And then that first chapter where she's seriously like waking up in a jail cell with this big bad sheriff coming in, and then like this sort of like general of a unit, so to speak, like you said when you're describing Freeman, which we'll get into him more later, walking in, I'm like, what? I actually think I reread it. I'm like, what was this? Like, this is not right. So I loved that. And then same as you. And then also what I really, really enjoyed about this book was the relationship between Catriona, Cat, they call her Cat for short, and her adoptive father, father figure, Amos. And I just, this happened in another story sort of that I watched on Netflix called Godless, which was fantastic. And in that series, a young boy sort of ran away or doesn't have his family anymore and gets adopted by this outlaw also. And he teaches him how to like whittle, for example, and make things. And so similar kind of thing happens. He teaches her how to shoot and teaches her, kind of how to survive in this rugged wilderness. And there's just these campfire moments with them where he genuinely cares for her and she cares for him and he guides her. And there's sort of this moment of uprise within their bandits, right? Where they're sort of challenging each other for, who might take the helm someday. And she gets very possessive and protective over him. And I found that, Lani did a really great job writing that parental relationship. It was nice.
Yeah, what I really kind of liked about that was it kind of made me think of other also like you, where you were thinking of this Godless show. I thought of like movies like Young Guns or the Zorro movies, but with Antonio Banderas, like where the almost whole scenes kind of just reminisced on this. Like the Captain Freeman really reminded me of the lieutenant from the Mask of Zorro, and the way the outlaws and like when they're in jail or they're doing their shootouts really reminded me of Young Guns and Young Guns 2, like the way those movies happened. Those were just kind of fun movies from my childhood, and this book really brought back a lot of kind of nostalgia for me.
I love that. This book was colorful too, and I've said this before, like playing books in my head, like visually seeing them. This book 100% played a bit like a screenplay. Like I could see this movie happening, and not a lot of location changes, and when they made sense. Very descriptive, and another plus. And I also want to go back to what you said about the drunk father. So she runs into the drunk father because at this train wreck happens that Rob describes, and like the bad guy comes back to get her, and she has to her Amos has to make a diversion so she can get away. It's all very much like a movie. And he tells her where to go, and it's this town and this church, and so she goes there, and she's essentially greeted at the door by a father. So you imagine him in his robes, right? Got his little white thing right here, and he's drunk. Like, it's hilarious. So and then she has to, you know, convince him who she is, and she's able to do that. And like, he kind of recounts these stories of Amos and their relationship, and this is actually where she learns that he has been stealing from the rich to give to the poor, or in this case, the missions. And I think that was just a nice wholesome add to the story. And might I add, I kind of cringe sometimes because I read enough bad books. I've read enough things that have like enough sex in them, I'll say that when I read about this young girl, she's young, what is she, 16, 17? I can't remember.
I think the main part of the story, she's in her 20s.
Okay, well, when she's found by the bandits,
yeah,
she's
she was
a
like
young girl.
13 or 14, yeah.
And I've been burned enough okay, oh, that's right. So I've been burned enough to think like, oh no, a young girl and a band of just dudes, like bad stuff's gonna happen. And no, this book's just wholesome from the get-go.
And that's one of the things that kind of reminded me even of like the Young Guns, because like there's the Reckoners, which was the Billy the Kid's kind of gang back in the Old West. And really, they weren't the bad guys. They were trying to do justice in their own way. And that's what this kind of outlaw gang is kind of like. All of them are people that have been branded by society as being enemies of society. They're not necessarily, and she actually does a very good job of explaining like some of their not the whole gang, but at least some of them. She explains some of their backstories, and you kind of get a feel of why these people are outlaws. They're not just faceless, you know, outlaws. They're like, one of them, he fell in love with the wrong person, and that's why he's an outlaw. And another one, he stole as a child and has been branded as a thief, and therefore no one will ever hire him. Being a bandit is essentially all he's got going for him. And so these are not bad people. They're outlaws because they're outside the law, not necessarily because they're the bad guys. Because the real bad guys is the barons.
Yeah, I think it wasn't prepared for the whole wholesomeness aspect of the book. And it's just feels weird from the beginning with the Western, then goes into, feels like a movie, then goes into, wow, magical saint, kind of religious stuff, to just wholesome the whole time.
Yeah. I mean, and some of the things, like my favorite scene in this book was actually, there's this jailbreak scene, and it really has this kind of Looney Tunes logic to it. Like, and I don't mean that in a bad way. I mean that if I were playing in like a role-playing game, like a Dungeons and Dragons type of game, and this whole jailbreak would be the kind of insane, dumbass plan that we would come up with for how we're going to do this jailbreak. It's going to involve like sticking, you know, lock picks inside a loaf of bread, and, you know, random explosions, and, you know, distractions. And like, my favorite part is like when one of the characters, like, there's like, oh, don't worry about the distraction. I know what I'm going to do. I've kind of always wanted to do this for a long time. And right when I read that, I was like, yeah, I know what I would be doing if this was like a role-playing game. And sure as hell, that's exactly what he had in mind. It was just a fun kind of romp.
Yeah, really was. Even in the train wreck scene, you know, I think when she comes to after the whole thing happened, she's sort of upside down, grabs this bar, flips around it, hauls herself out the window, ends up on a horse, rides away kind of into the sunset. So we align very much on what we really enjoyed about the book, but it's that time. We talk about what we didn't love about the book before we get into spoilers. So just lightly what we didn't love about the book.
I think essentially the only thing I really would say I disliked in this book was there's a bit of overuse of repetition. specifically the book title. The book title is Face the Night, and uh, if this was a Cinema Sins review of a movie, that ding would be going off like crazy because it's Face the Night, that phrase and the related phrase around it, because it's a whole kind of mantra for the main character. It just comes up a lot. It's a after a bit, it does get a bit old. It's not that it's not a problem. It's just I think it would actually benefited from being used less. It would be more meaningful.
Yeah, same. I
Similar.
read Face the Night a few times and I was like, oh, okay, I get it. You got to challenge your fears, girl.
Yeah. And there's a similar kind of repetition that happens because unlike our previous books so far, this one actually has two point of view characters. There's essentially the person we've talked about so far, Black Cat, and the love interest, Adrian. And they each are point of view characters, and it kind of alternates between the two. Where some of the and that's great actually. It's nice to see multiple points of view in a story because they have very different world views and even views of the similar scenes. However, there's a little bit of kind of frustrating repetition that happens when it transitions from one character to the other character, where it'll actually repeat things from one page ago because as if I'd already forgot what happened one page ago. I think what she was trying to do is try to show how the characters were maybe reacting to the same information differently. However, I think it's better done when essentially you just trust the audience will understand that both characters received the same information.
And you can do that when the subject matter of the book is deep and when the reading level's high and you're changing locations a lot and characters a lot. But for a book like this, it's young adult. It's not a high reading level. It's not a high deep subject matter. So yeah, I feel you on that. Going back and forth, just it didn't add anything to the story. I didn't need the extra vantage point in several of those situations.
Yeah, and so like in a book like let's say Game of Thrones, um, the story advances linearly, at all times. You just and when if only one they show one point of view's character on a given scene, there might be five other point of view characters in that scene. They're just not going to bother with that. They're just going to skip ahead to the next time you get a different point of view character. It's in the future. So it was just and like I said, this is just being a little picky, but that would be something I would have preferred to have been different.
Yeah, my criticism of the book was just that this kind of plays into what you said about going back and forth. It just wasn't meaty enough. There just wasn't a ton of depth to it. This is a feel good book. This is Lani Forbes. We talked about this in the intro episode to which books we were reading. This book was written posthumously, and she knew it was her last book when she was writing it. And I think it's nice to know that she wanted to get out like a really nice story. And so I think that's nice. Just didn't have like a ton of depth to it. So that was a bit of a criticism there, but it was fun to read. If I had to change anything about it, really, I would just change the fact that I thought the book was very predictable. And it is a light read, and with light reads comes some predictability, but it's almost too much for me. There's this moment where she's about to become the governess to come in and take care of the younger sister of Adrian, her former friend. And she wants him to not notice her. She's really nervous that he might recognize who she is, so she has to dye her hair. And it's too dark. It mentions it's too dark, and like the priest does it. And I'm like, wait, the drunken priest is dyeing your hair? Like, he's gonna know. He's gonna know who you are. And sure enough, the dye doesn't last very long. It starts to wear off. He starts to notice hints of red in the sun, and it's like, okay, well, called that one. And then getting into spoilers a little bit, but not too bad. There's this moment where she's doing her governess duties, and she's playing with the daughter. The daughter's name is actually Edith. So she's playing with Edith by a creek. And she says to her, and this stood out to me, she says, "Oh, you need to be careful around this creek at certain times of the year. It's known to flood." And I was like, "Oh, this creek's gonna flood. This little girl's gonna get caught in a flood. And that's bad, right?" And I was like, "Oh no!" And it made it too easy. There's just too many of these predictable moments.
Yeah, I would say that I understand what you mean by predictability. I think there is a certain good thing about predictability, rather because it's really popular to do things like subvert expectations, which I can find is just as frustrating. For example, like going back to, I mentioned Game of Thrones earlier, George R. R. Martin, in an interview, he was talking about how if people can predict what's going to happen in the future in your book, that probably means that you gave them the right clues. Whereas like something like the producers of the television show of Game of Thrones, they went out of their way to try to subvert the expectations by saying, we're going to do things that you wouldn't predict, even if it doesn't really make sense within the book or the story. So I think some amount of predictability is fine. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. But if it's too predictable, I do understand what you're saying.
A little too predictable, but that's okay. That's okay. I had one more thing that I didn't love, and that's this sort of like woe is me sort of character. She kept constantly blaming herself for her parents' death. And it was this sort of, that kind of leads into what you were saying earlier with mentioning the title again. I just gotta face the night. I just gotta face it. And it was just, Kat, to me, didn't feel like a woe is me character. I felt like she'd broken through a lot of that when she found herself. We have to sort of remind our listeners here that she was a baroness's daughter. Like, she was of the wealthy. She was raised, sort of not silver spoon, but like, among the rancher affluent, so to speak. And she went from that to sharpshooter bandit. She'd already had a massive amount of growth. So the fact after this massive amount of growth and the repetitive kind of woe is me, oh, the death was my fault, but it was my fault. She cries out to the drunken priest at one point in the story, like, but it's my fault. And that kind of got to me after a while too, of like, no, girl, Kat, you are tough. You are a sharpshooting bandit. You need to stop it. But trauma, we all have to deal with trauma. We all deal with it differently. So, I get it. There's no therapists back in the West.
Okay. I guess, do you want to go through anything you want to discuss? We'll do some spoiler conversation here. So we'll skip ahead if you don't want to hear this part. So spoiler alert, we're going to discuss we're going to discuss the later part of this book. In order to kind of understand what we need to discuss, we have to kind of tell you a little bit more about the plot of the story. So Kat went undercover as a governess for Baron Caldwell, in order to basically help to train his daughter to basically be a proper lady. But her purpose really was to help uncover what this Baron's plot was. His plot, which is the whole reason why I kind of went to Zorro, is because it sounds a lot like a Zorro kind of story, where he wants to be declared governor of this territory so he can basically gather all this Orium, this resource which has magical powers to it, so that he can essentially rise in rebellion against the far-off empire. In fact, they even deliver Orium to him in grain sacks. And like I said, in a very Zorro-esque or Old West type of mode. Which was, like I said, I thought that was a fun part of the story. But as the end of the story gets here, it's now time for all the barons to gather and vote and decide who they're gonna recommend to become the new governor of this territory, because they're gonna recommend it, and then the emperor will generally just rubber stamp whoever they recommend. And so that's where we're gonna kind of do a lot of this spoiler discussion.
Yeah, and that's actually very Scooby-Doo also, the way you describe that. Like, hauling in these grain sacks. And we're now to the part of the book where they gotta pull the mask off the guy's head and be like, who done it? And that's, I remember like chuckling kind of at that part, because this is also sort of where she gets discovered. So keep in mind, she's came in as this governess, but she's not Cat anymore. I forgot to say earlier, she's Rose, right? So how does this all come together? How does she get her lands back? How do they find out who done it? And how does she go from Rose to Cat in Adrian's eyes? So this all kind of begins, as you said, when they're hauling in these grain sacks. She sneaks out of the house. Why is she there in that house? Why didn't she just go in guns a-blazing and just kill the Baron? Right? That the Father Ignatius brings that up earlier. She says, why don't I just go kill him? I got guns. Let's go do it. He's like, no, we gotta uncover this plot, right? So we gotta pull the mask off the head of the governor. He has nefarious plans. You can't just shoot him. We need to know why. All right. So she's on the ranch. She sneaks out. She dresses in like old Adrian clothes, you know, and well, she's more comfortable in, by the way, because she's a bandit. She's been having to wear all these tight kind of laced up dresses and corsets. It's not her deal. So she sneaks out, finds the hidden grain stashes. It's really Orium, and she sees this craziest thing happen, which sort of goes into where this plot starts to really thicken. When she discovers the grain, one of the workers who's handling this Aurum, which keep in mind, if you come into contact with it, however it was cursed, it's gonna curse you with the power of that saint. So I can't remember if the gun was in the grain or the gun made contact with the grain, but what happens is one of the workers kills himself with it. And I can't remember if someone told him how or two.
So the grain was actually like leaking. Like there was a little rip,
Right.
There was a tear in the bag, and it basically leaked onto his hand, and he was cursed with essentially obedience. And one of the other just guys working there just kind of offhanded was like, why don't you just kill yourself? Like, you
Yes.
dumbass type of statement. And the guy's like, yeah, pulls out a gun and shoots himself, which was actually pretty shocking for the general tone of the story overall.
Yes. So she gets caught sneaking out. Won't go into too much to that, but Adrian eventually finds out her secret. They start working together to figure out why his dad's being the way he is, and realizes he's controlling people with the use of this Aurum, which has been cursed with that obedience saint. I forget his name, but we can look it up and put it up on the screen for you in retrospect. And so really we find out that the Baron wants to be governor, and he's doing that by controlling the voters. So he's given out these gifts in some cases, and one of them is he gives Edith a gift, so she'll behave at a party, for example. And so this starts really unraveling as she sees, someone shoots themselves. Edith starts behaving when she was previously very, very naughty. She sees a gold necklace on her that wasn't there before, so she realizes that this is how the Baron has been doing this.
Yeah, and and essentially, as the vote is happening, he basically sprinkles this tiny bit of this Aurum in all their wine, because just that tiny bit of Aurum will only give them a few, maybe minutes at best, of obedience. But you're just casting a vote. How much time do you really need?
Right. So, and then this is where we get into actually a con of mine, a criticism that I couldn't get into earlier, because it would have been a spoiler. But here's where I don't know why. I love a lot of different books, fantasy books, and one of them is like Good Omens. Have you like even seen the Netflix show? Or it's fantastic.
Yeah, it's great.
Right? Good angel, bad angel. And so I feel like sometimes like that's done really, really well. And then another example is like Supernatural. You have the fallen angel becomes the devil and all this stuff. So I guess this is where I didn't love where we find kind of the pulled off the mask moments, and Freeman, the guy who, like was trying to apprehend her, trying to bring her in as an outlaw, that was taking her from the jail cell, was hauling her back on the train to get her back to whoever his person was that was hiring him, which turned out to be the Baron. We find out that Freeman is not really Freeman. He's the fallen saint. And I don't know, this kind of rubbed me the wrong way. I don't know why. I think I wanted the fallen saint to stay more anonymous. Or sort of just this presence, kind of like how the other saints were like presences. And so this fallen saint, the spirit of him took over Freeman's body and was having Freeman act his will. And this is where we also sort of find out that the Baron has also been being controlled by Freeman as well. So it's Freeman's will is happening, but Freeman is actually the fallen saint. Yeah. I don't know. What do you think about that?
I mean, I was a little bit caught off guard by the whole Freeman twist, that twist in the story, because while you said you were kind of mentioning that some of the plot was very predictable, I really didn't see this one because the story as a whole plays very, very upfront about what this story is. It's very openly just a Western. In fact, up until this time, you could have just stripped the magic out of this story entirely, and it still would have been a fun Western story. So in a way, it's good that some real more supernatural happens to really make sure that this is an actual supernatural fantasy story. But I really didn't see this coming because nothing really built up to that the saints were a manifest presence in this world.
It just didn't fit for me because, as you said, we could have almost taken or left the magic. She could have just been a great sharpshooter without the magic in the story. It almost didn't even need it. And so since it almost didn't even need it, and it was kind of a nice thing, the blessed and the saints, it was a nice thing. It was a nice to have. And then we take it and we go supernatural with it, as you said, and like just this saint is walking around in a meat suit. Like, as they say, even in Supernatural, he's wearing his meat suit, and he used to be human himself. So he used to be a human himself, then becomes a saint, then falls, but now is walking around as a human again. I kind of like, my brain was just like, why? Especially when there's so many other saints that we talked about. There's really only Catriona, Cat Rose, who shows off and discusses being blessed. And so I almost would have rather had another blessed or someone else be blessed, or maybe drunken Father Ignatius ends up having some blessed. Literally anything else would have made me happier here in this moment. But that's okay. It's not a bad thing. It was just, yeah.
I think it
different.
Almost I think part of the purpose with the Fallen was to compare and contrast with Baron Caldwell, because Baron Caldwell up until this kind of moment has been the kind of dastardly villain, the mustache twirling, white suit in the old West wearing villain. And even he is kind of revolted by the presence of this fallen saint, and he's like, no, I did all this for me, not for you. I'm not a follower of you. And so it's almost like this anti-redemption story for him, because he's not redeemed. He's very clearly not even feeling bad about anything he's done, and he's done plenty of bad, but he's like, but I'm not that bad. I'm this bad, not that bad. And I think it's kind of like, I think that's the main the purpose here was so that I almost feel like that, so that Baron Caldwell could go down without you having to really feel too bad for his kids losing their father.
Okay, that's fair. Yeah, it's not like I didn't hate it. I just, it fit funny. Square peg, round hole. I don't know. Just okay. Odd.
All right. Well, I guess we should discuss we normally we'd be going into show me the map here, but there really isn't a map.
No
But
map. Good glossary though.
yeah, there's the guide to the saints. Even though we really only see the powers of maybe 2 or 3 of them, there's a full list of the saints and all their abilities and like what they're a saint of and what powers they grant people. And I think that was actually very interesting as a world building type of element, and you could refer back once in a while, which kind of is the purpose of a map, is something as a reference point.
And I think that actually, if we think about it like that, and I've thought about this often as I've kind of thought about Lani in her life and what she gave to the world as an author, and I thought the idea of the Saints was cool. I think it would have been nice to see what Lani could have done if she had more time, and what like an expanded series would have been given more time. And I think this had a lot of potential in terms of exploring. I like actually when series fall within a story, but the stories don't have to connect. So like they're all in the same universe. So maybe at the same time in another part of the land, we have someone that's blessed in another way. So this has a lot that it could have done, and I think that that's cool.
And that's something I like in a lot of book series. I like a lot of what are called like shared universes stories, things like the Dungeons and Dragons novel series or comic books in general are essentially shared universes. So you're constantly getting different snippets from different areas in a story, in a world, and actually that's a good way to expand the world without like bogging it down in like dozens of novels. One of my favorite book series of all time is actually the Dresden Files. But to recommend that to a new person at this point in the series is a hard recommend, because they're what, 18 books in now, and those are dense books. At least a good half of them are pretty substantial books. And so to recommend that to someone is like they're just seeing this giant stack of books and they're like, no, I'm not going to do that. But if it's like a shared universe type of book series, like what you just described is potentially what this could have become, where it's expanding horizontally rather than vertically, where you got a story here and a story here, and you get to see the world from many points of view. I think that would have been very interesting. Like if maybe each book was focused on a different blessed.
And then when we would have had no more fallen saints, I wouldn't have had to read about it again. All right, so no map, but also no crossbows.
No.
We just we failed in that sense. No crossbows, no maps. It's time to rate this book, Rob.
All right. So, I always start off with, is this a book that I would want to read the sequel to? And I would say for this book, yeah, I totally would. I really did enjoy this book. It's kind of a light, quick read. It's not I think it's half the page count of like the last couple books. So it's something that you can read very quickly and kind of and it's a fun read. It kind of has that action movie Zorro type of feel to it, and so it's a good fun read. It's not, is it my favorite type of story? No, but it brought a lot of nostalgia and good feels, and I had a good time. So I would actually rate this a 4, mostly because I just enjoyed it. I didn't have there was nothing that ruined it for me. Even my little pet peeves were just that. They were just kind of nuisances, and I really enjoyed reading this book.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I love that. And actually I went into this book review thinking I might rate it a bit lower. Sometimes like you grow as you start talking about things more. And I'm really starting to fall in love with the idea of like the 12 patron saints. And if this were continued, like if it were separate stories like you said, I would really like to read those. Being that it's just one kind of lowers it a bit for me. But yeah, I would recommend this to somebody just wanting a quick read. A lot of people just want a quick read. We're all busy. And I travel a lot, so I'm often looking for airport books. This is a fantastic airport book. I think I read this book in a day. So I'm going to give it a 3.8.
You and your points.
I don't know. It's not a 4, though. It didn't even have a map.
I wasn't rating the map.
No, I know. Yeah, just predictability for me. But I also read a lot more in this genre. So in this genre for me, not quite. Okay. But fun.
So if you've enjoyed this review so far, next week Lana will be doing our midpoint review of our next book, my selection, Some Desperate Glory. And then in 2 weeks we'll both be here to give our review of that book.
And something tells me it won't be as fun as this book, but I'm still looking forward to it, Rob.
Well, that's how this adult book club works, is we each pick a book and torture the other one with our choices.
Please make sure to join our Discord, rapidly growing a community there. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Make sure to help make suggestions as well, because if you give us suggestions there, it might actually make it onto the show. So also, please make sure to like and subscribe, because if you don't, I'm going to have Robert do the next show as Zorro, since he's so fond of the character.
Oh, yeah.